A Song for Silas by Lori Wick. Chapter 16. Silas and Amy spent the first few minutes at the church reacquainting Silas with members of the church family. Many of the faces were familiar, giving Silas a warm sense of belonging. Amy's prediction had been correct. Mrs. Anderson bore down upon them with surprising speed, dragging two very shy-looking daughters in her wake. Even though Silas must have been a lost cause in Mrs. Anderson's eyes, he was introduced to Brenda and Claire. They were indeed shy, and Silas felt a little sorry for the awkward situation in which their mother had put them. With the introduction over, Silas turned to see if Amy was ready to go, only to find her studying him intently. "Did you change your mind about my looks, without a beard?" Amy didn't answer his teasing question, but continued to stare at him for a few moments, completely unaware of her scrutiny. "Amy, is something wrong?" "Silas, why aren't you married?" "What?" Silas bent low over Amy to lessen the difference in their heights. He was sure he had misunderstood her. "What did you say?" "I asked you why you've never married, but I'm sorry I did. It's none of my business." Amy could feel the warmth in her cheeks as Silas looked at her in confusion. What was the matter with her? She was never uncomfortable with Silas, and not at all used to making a fool of herself. Amy watched as Silas opened his mouth to speak, but the church bell began to ring, and Amy was sure the relief she saw on Silas's face was just as evident as her own. Silas sat in the second bench as Amy moved a few feet up to the piano. Her movements were sure and graceful, but to Silas she looked preoccupied. Whatever had prompted her to question him regarding his marital status? Silas wanted to mull the thought over, but the service was starting, and he tried to shift his mind to the present. Silas watched as Pastor Johnson stepped behind the small pulpit at the front of the church. The man was small, petite in height and frame, but he had an air of authority about him, and his sermons were doctrinally sound. As much as Silas enjoyed his preaching, he had a feeling that today his mind would be elsewhere. With effort he pulled his mind away from Amy as the pastor led the small congregation in a few songs. The pastor then directed everyone to turn to Psalm 121 and to follow along as he read. "I will lift up mine eyes unto the hills, from whence cometh my help. My help cometh from the Lord, who made heaven and earth. He will not suffer thy foot to be moved. He that keepeth thee will not slumber. Behold, he that keepeth Israel shall neither slumber nor sleep. The Lord is thy keeper. The Lord is thy shade upon thy right hand. The sun shall not smite thee by day, nor the moon by night. The Lord shall preserve thee from all evil. He shall preserve thy soul. The Lord shall preserve thy going out and thy coming in from this time forth, even for evermore." They sang two more songs and then were launched into the sermon. Snatches of the message from 1 John came through to Silas, but for the most part he was miles away. He glanced at Amy often and noticed she didn't even have her Bible open. When Amy rose from his side to play the closing hymn, Silas was appalled. What was the matter with him that he could not even take time from his own thoughts to hear God's word preached? For the most part, Silas and Amy were quiet on the ride back to the farm. Amy's mind kept returning to the few words she had with Silas before going into the church. Her embarrassment kept her quiet, not only for the ride home, but for most of the day. Sunday was usually spent relaxing, so when Grant was settled back in his bed for the noon meal, Amy went off to her room for the rest of the afternoon. Silas spent the day in his room also. He prayed and read his Bible for over 2 hours. For some reason, his prayers were very concentrated on Amy, and by the time supper rolled around, he couldn't even think of her without feeling tears at the back of his eyes. The day passed so quietly that Silas couldn't help wondering what Monday and the new week would bring.